Imagine an organization that essentially functions as the absolute first line of defense for a nation under perpetual siege.
Right?
And we are talking about an entity operating with a massive 10 billion shekel budget, which is roughly 2.73 billion US dollars.
It's a staggering amount of money.
It really is. It commands around 7,000 personnel, and it holds a track record of over 2,700 assassinations.
Yeah, which is just unprecedented.
Exactly. So how does an agency operating entirely in the shadows function in a modern, hyper-connected world? Today, we're doing a deep dive into what our source material calls the Mossad's architecture of ambiguity.
And the baseline of that architecture is just this staggering paradox.
How so?
Well, you have an agency that is globally ubiquitous in pop culture, right? Everyone knows the name. Yet domestically, it operates with absolute legal invisibility.
Totally off the books.
Yeah, I mean, it bypasses the Knesset entirely. It sits completely outside standard oversight bodies. It reports exclusively to the prime minister. And everything they do is driven by this foundational philosophy of preemptive action, like asymmetric intervention. You can actually see this mindset distilled in their official motto, which is drawn from the Book of Proverbs.
Oh, right. I saw that in the source. Without guidance do a people fall, and deliverance is in a multitude of counselors.
Exactly.
Okay, let's unpack this, because to really wrap your head around how they manage that ambiguity, I was thinking about their structure while reading the material.
Yeah, it's definitely unique.
Right. You can't look at them like a traditional government bureau. It's almost more accurate to view them like a massive corporate conglomerate, but instead of selling products, they deal in total intelligence.
That's a really good way to put it. That decentralized model is exactly how they partition the risk.
So break down the departments for us.
Sure. So instead of one massive apparatus, you have highly specialized siloed directorates. First, you have the Mossad.
That's the kinetic arm, right?
Yeah, they handle sabotage and paramilitary operations. And embedded right within that is the Kedon unit.
The tip of the spear.
Exactly. They are the operatives trained specifically for, well, clinical eliminations. But then operating in a completely different lane, you have the Lillehammer psychology, or LAP.
And they do psychological warfare?
Right, psychological warfare and deception. And finally, you have the political action and liaison department. They handle secret diplomacy, mostly with nations that officially refuse to even acknowledge Israel's existence.
It's just wild how compartmentalized it is. And because they operate in this fragmented way, they kind of exist in a perpetual gray zone.
Yeah, they really do.
The source document actually anchors its analysis by examining a collection of denied operations it calls the Dark Quintet.
Which is a fascinating framework.
It really is. But what stands out to me isn't just the timeline of these events, it's the evolution of the underlying psychology. Like, you can trace how their definition of a threat completely mutated over the decades.
Right, and it starts with some pretty messy, catastrophic attempts at geopolitical manipulation.
Yeah, it wasn't always high-tech precision.
Not at all. I mean, the evolution is really the story of the agency learning its own limits through failure. Take the 1954 Lillehammer Affair, for instance.
Also known as Operation Susanna, right?
Yes. And the mindset back then was rooted in very blunt force statecraft. Israeli intelligence wanted to prevent British troops from withdrawing from the Suez Canal zone.
Because they feared a British exit would leave them vulnerable to Egypt's Gamal Abdel Nasser.
Exactly. So they decided to essentially manufacture a crisis.
But, I mean, how do you execute a false flag operation on that scale without leaving fingerprints?
Well, in this case, very poorly.
Yeah, it was a disaster.
Complete disaster. The mechanism relied on recruiting a proxy network of Egyptian Jews to plant incendiary devices in Western-owned installations.
Like cinemas and cafes.
Yeah, and United States Information Agency offices. The strategic logic was that these bombings would be blamed on the Muslim Brotherhood.
Which would then convince the British that the Egyptian government couldn't maintain stability.
Right. But the execution failed at the most basic logistical level. An explosive device literally accidentally detonated in an operative's pocket.
While he was standing in line at a cinema in Alexandria, right?
Yes.
I mean, that is the literal definition of a catastrophic backfire.
It completely unraveled the entire network. It led to public trials, 2 executions by the Egyptian government, and this massive domestic political firestorm.
Which forced the resignation of Defense Minister Pinas Lavan.
Exactly. And the source emphasizes that this wasn't just, a botched mission. It became a permanent institutional scar. It served as a permanent internal warning against using false flag terrorism as a diplomatic instrument.
Because the blowback was just way too severe.
Yeah, it was simply too messy.
But, dropping false flag operations didn't mean they stopped crossing profound ethical
Oh,
lines.
not at all.
Right, because as the nature of the threat shifted from raw military borders to advanced weaponry, their pragmatism became incredibly ruthless.
Let's look at Operation Damocles in the early 1960s.
The German scientist issue. Exactly. Egypt was developing long-range rocket technology, heavily assisted by West German scientists who had worked on the Nazi V-2 rocket program.
So the Mossad launched a massive intimidation campaign.
Using letter bombs, which ended up killing 5 Egyptian workers. But the detail that literally stops you in your tracks is their recruitment of Otto Skorzeny.
To assassinate a Munich-based hardware supplier named Heinz Krug.
Yeah, and I have to push back on this, or at least ask the question. Skorzeny was a former SS lieutenant colonel. He was widely known as Hitler's favorite commando.
Right.
Isn't recruiting an SS officer the ultimate betrayal of the state's founding purpose as a sanctuary for the Jewish people?
What's fascinating here is how the source answers that exact contradiction. It really dedicates significant analysis to it.
And what's the conclusion?
It comes down to a survivalist calculus that strips away all ideology. To the operatives at the time, the existential safety of the state in the immediate present outweighed historical or ethical grievances.
Even against Holocaust perpetrators.
Exactly. The logic was cold. Skorzeny had the access and the lethal skill set required to neutralize an active impending threat.
So it was just pure pragmatism.
Yeah. If leveraging a war criminal prevented a future strike on Tel Aviv, the moral compromise was viewed as a necessary cost of doing business.
Wow. And that cold calculus just expands as we move into the modern era. I mean, the definition of a combatant completely blurs.
Yeah, we see that clearly by 1990.
With the assassination of Gerald Bull, that's where we see the formalization of scientists as legitimate military targets.
Right, because Bull was a ballistics engineer.
He was the architect of Saddam Hussein's Project Babylon, those literal superguns capable of firing projectiles thousands of kilometers.
So the Mossad shot him 5 times outside his apartment in Brussels to neutralize that technological threat.
But the agency's definition of a threat didn't stop at kinetic weapons or scientists. It eventually scaled up to target international legal frameworks.
You're talking about the shadow war against the International Criminal Court?
Yes, exactly. And before we dive into the mechanics of that, I want to step in here and be crystal clear with you, the listener.
Good point.
We are not endorsing any political viewpoints regarding the ICC, the Israeli government, or the Palestinian territories. We are strictly reporting the operational tactics as they are detailed in our source material.
It is a vital distinction to make because the tactics the source describes here are intense. From 2015 to 2024, the agency allegedly waged a systematic campaign to undermine the ICC's investigations into the Palestinian territories.
And the fascinating part is the mechanism of this shadow war. Like, how do you sabotage a court of law?
Well, you don't use explosives. You use the tools of the digital gray zone.
Spying, hacking.
Yeah, and what the source specifically terms Cosa Nostra-style blackmail.
Directed at Chief Prosecutor Fatou Bensouda, so they essentially weaponized information.
Entirely. They reportedly intercepted communications to map out internal court disputes, and they applied pressure to Bensouda's family members to threaten her professional standing.
It's a striking example of how the agency evolved.
It really is. A legal body attempting to exert jurisdiction was treated with the exact same institutional urgency as a hostile state developing a ballistics program.
Because both were viewed as existential threats to their freedom of action.
Exactly. And both require neutralization.
But, it's not like the agency has abandoned massive kinetic strikes. In fact, they recently scaled up to the absolute apex of state power.
Yes, Operation Epic Fury.
Which happened just weeks ago in February 2026. A joint Mossad and CIA daylight decapitation strike.
Against Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei.
Using 30 precision munitions and Sparrow air-launched ballistic missiles. I mean, hitting a sitting head of state changes the entire geopolitical chessboard.
It absolutely does.
Yeah.
And it led to Moshtaba Khamenei taking power, plus massive retaliatory drone strikes.
Which triggered a temporary ceasefire mediated by Pakistan and China.
Right, but from a purely operational standpoint, it demonstrated the agency's capacity to hit the absolute highest level of authority.
So we have this sweeping history of lethal force, intimidation, and these high-tech decapitation strikes. But the source makes a really compelling pivot here.
Yeah, regarding their successes and failures.
Exactly. When you analyze the absolute extremes of their operational history, the narrative totally flips. The source argues that the Mossad's absolute greatest success involved no bloodshed at all.
While its worst failure was a botched physical elimination.
Let's talk about the apex first. Operation Diamond in 1966.
Right. At the time, the Soviet-made MiG-21 was the most advanced fighter jet on the planet.
And Western intelligence was completely blind to its capabilities. It created a massive intelligence gap.
So rather than trying to, sabotage the jets on a runway, they went after the pilot's psychology.
Which is infinitely harder, but infinitely more valuable. They identified Munir Redfa.
A high-ranking Iraqi pilot. He was an Assyrian Christian who felt frustrated and marginalized by the regime.
And they used psychological recruitment. They convinced him to defect.
Yeah, and on August 16th, 1966, he flew a fully armed MiG-21 directly out of Iraq and landed in Israel.
The strategic yield of that is mind-boggling.
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, uncovering the MiG-21's specific flight blind spots directly allowed the Israeli Air Force to develop bespoke dogfighting tactics.
Which were completely decisive in Operation Focus.
Exactly, wiping out the Egyptian Air Force in the opening hours of the 1967 Six-Day War.
Now, contrast that bloodless triumph with the nadir, the Khaled Mashal attempt in 1997.
Right, sanctioned by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu.
To me, Operation Diamond was like a flawless psychological chess match. While the Mashal operation reads like a botched Hollywood heist movie that just creates a geopolitical nightmare.
Yeah, it's a very accurate analogy. It's a cascading failure. Two Kaido agents posing as Canadian tourists tried to inject a fentanyl-derived nerve toxin into the Hamas leader's ear.
On the street in Amman, Jordan.
Yeah, and they were caught.
So unpack the strategic blowback for us, because it was massive, right?
Oh, it's a humiliating reversal. King Hussein of Jordan threatened to literally execute the agents unless Israel provided the chemical antidote.
So Netanyahu had to save the man he just tried to kill.
Yes. And to get his agents back, he had to release Hamas' spiritual leader, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, from prison.
And accept the resignation of Mossad chief Danny Yotam.
Exactly. It massively strengthened Hamas and nearly broke the Israel-Jordan peace treaty.
So the sheer risk of human error in physical missions like that Mishal disaster clearly drove the agency's 21st century pivot.
Absolutely. They needed cleaner options, particularly against Iran's nuclear program.
Right. The shift toward technology and what the source calls the inside-out approach.
Yeah, the sabotage at the Natanz uranium enrichment facility is astonishing. In 2020, explosives were embedded in construction materials.
Bought via Mossad front companies years in advance.
Yes, and then in 2021, the agency allegedly recruited up to 10 Iranian scientists who actually smuggled in supplementary explosives.
Which destroyed 90% of the site's centrifuges.
And set the program back 9 months. All without a physical Israeli hit team on the ground.
It's like science fiction warfare. Same with the November 2020 assassination of Iran's top nuclear scientist, Mohsen Fakhrizadeh.
Right. He was killed by a remotely operated, satellite-controlled machine gun.
Which was smuggled into Iran in pieces.
And assembled on the roadside. It completely paralyzed the Iranian security apparatus.
But here's where it gets really interesting. I want to push back on this. If they have satellite AI machine guns and can recruit scientists deep underground, can an agency become too high-tech for its own good?
This raises an important question, and the source actually introduces this as the paradox of success.
What does that mean exactly?
Well, operations like the Imad Monia hit in 2008 or the 2026 Khamenei strike, they create a halo effect. It leads to institutional hubris.
Which brings us to the devastating intelligence failure of October 7, 2023.
Exactly. Despite having the Jericho Wall attack plans a full year in advance, the intelligence community says that Hamas just lacked the creativity and competence to execute it.
So it wasn't a lack of data.
No, it was a failure of analysis, a cognitive bias. The obsession with high-tech, gray zone, targeted killings, diverted resources away from basic tactical interception.
And open media monitoring. They missed the obvious threat right on their immediate borders.
Because they were too busy looking at server farms and satellite feeds.
You know, it's something you, the listener, can probably relate to in your own life or career. Relying too heavily on our greatest strength, like their high-tech kinetic supremacy, can create massive cognitive blind spots where we miss the obvious threats right on our doorstep.
Absolutely. The ultimate lesson from the Mossad's history is that the most advanced technology is no substitute for accurate strategic assessment.
Right. So as a final synthesis, where does the agency go from here?
Well, the agency's future relies on integrating its cyberkinetic capabilities with its doctrine of ambiguity. The 2026 Khamenei strike proved that even massive decapitation events don't immediately collapse hostile systems.
Because those systems are built to absorb shock. Before we wrap up, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, drawn directly from the source's concluding philosophy.
It's a heavy one.
It is. The source states the Mossad operates on the conviction that force always counts for more than foreknowledge.
Right.
So, if a nation continuously relies on ruthless, extra-legal force to ensure its own survival, at what point does that force permanently erode the very international norms and laws the state relies upon to exist in the global community?
It's the defining question of their existence.
It really is. Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Stay insanely curious, and we'll catch you next time.